We are standing on holy ground. We are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses that's far greater than we can possibly imagine. In John Meekum's recent book, Soul of America, he begins with James Baldwin's quote, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not something to be read, and it does not refer merely or principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history in its literally present form is in all that we do." When I stop to think, it's when I was a student here some 55 years ago, and I walked these halls and went to these buildings, I saw names that represented for me who we were. I thought of Moot Hall. I thought of the administration building as the Cullen Building. I thought of Martin Reuter, where I lived, as the Martin Reuter Hall Residence Counselor. I also thought about so many other things that went on in our conference, such as the Bishop's Memorial Union. And then there was also the West Gymnasium, where we had our gymnasium and our basketball teams. It was all part of who we were. Those names represented things of who we are and what we represent. But little did I realize as I finished exactly how powerful those names were. Because what we have is a tremendous presence among us that, quite frankly, we may not fully be able to comprehend or understand. Let's think back to 1830s. William B. Travis wrote a letter to New York. He said, "Send more Methodist preachers to Texas." And they heard that word. The first to send it was the Mississippi Annual Conference. They sent a young man named by Martin Reuter. He had such fascination and passion for this land. If you read Ralph Wood Jones' book, 1840 to 1961, written originally about Southwestern University, you hear about the excitement that he had as he came to this new land. Unfortunately, he died within just a few months after he arrived. But then there were others that came in. They came in through East Texas. Came in with Littleton Fowler and Robert Alexander. The first Methodist worship service that we had, as we know of, is at McMahon's Chapel in San Augustine, Texas. Littleton Fowler preached that sermon, and Methodism began in Texas in San Augustine, soon to be later in 1844 Wesleyan College. But then also we had another movement coming from the South. There was a young man who was the pastor of Lovely Lanes Chapel in Baltimore, Maryland. You may remember from your history that that is the place where the Methodist Episcopal Church got its start on Christmas Eve of 1784. T.O. Summers was his name. He boarded a ship in Baltimore. He landed on the shores of Galveston Island. He had been sent $1,800 with Chaplain William Ryland. Chaplain Ryland was the chaplain Senate of the Congress under President Andrew Jackson. He was here to start two churches. The first church he started in 1838 was called Ryland's Chapel, located in downtown Galveston. It was named after William Ryland, and it carried his name, until they changed their name sometime later as Moody Memorial First United Methodist Church. But he organized another church, 1839, on the Allen Landing of Buffalo Bayou. It was a small congregation made up of small numbers, but it began to grow. And it did. It was known as Shern Memorial, named after Charles Shern. It later changed its name in the early 1900s to First United Methodist Church, Houston. T.O. Summers organized two churches, Moody Church, Galveston, and First Methodist Church, Houston. It was in 1840 in Reutersville, Texas, outside of LaGrange, that the 5 or 6 congregations of Methodists gathered to form their first conference meeting. In that conference, they organized themselves as the Texas Conference. The next thing they did, they organized Reutersville College in 1840. That is the start of who we are. Chauncey Richardson was the first president, and they had a flourishing student body for a number of years. But getting back to the story, T.O. Summers, who was elected the secretary of the annual conference in 1840, was in Galveston for a couple more years, but then decided what he wanted to do was move on. And so he did. He moved to Nashville, and in Nashville, he created another small little liberal arts Methodist college with the help of Commodore Vanderbilt. T.O. Summers not only helped us to organize who we are, but he is the founding president of Vanderbilt University. You know, when you stop to think about the history and who we are and recognize that there have been others who've come before me who've laid the way, somehow things become a little richer and a little more powerful than who we are. And so we had, of course, Ruddersville in 1840. We had Wesleyan in 1844. We had Mackenzie in 1848. And then we had Soul in 1856. Mackenzie, outside of Texarkana in Clarksville, was known for a powerful evangelistic preaching. They had as many as 400 students at one time, and they were a powerful educator in biblical and expository preaching. We know that, of course, Soul University, located in Chapel Hill near Brenham, near Washington on the Brazos. For those of us who came from Houston, you went through Chapel Hill on the way here on 290. That was founded in 1856. And when the Civil War hit in 1860, it pretty well decimated its student body. But there was one member of its faculty by the name of Asheville Smith, who was a great friend of Samuel May Williams and Sam Houston. He helped with the Texas Revolution. But he also had a medical degree from Yale University. And so when he left Soul, he went to Galveston and decided to help others start a Galveston Medical College. Today, when you go to UTMB, you're stepping into the Asheville Smith building because he's the one who helped to found UTMB in 1890. What's so also interesting is that we not only founded UTMB, but in the early part of the 20th century founded another medical school. It carries our name. We no longer own it, but it's known as Southwestern Medical School, University of Texas in Dallas. When you stop to think about the history and who we are and what we represent, it represents far more than we can possibly ever imagine. But by far, the greatest story to be told about who we are is the life of Francis Asbury Mood. You will see a monument outside the Cullen building as you pass, and most people from time to time may stop and read it, but please do. He was born in 1830 in Charlottesville, South Carolina. He was ordained as a young man early in his life. He felt the call to ministry, was the pastor of the Trinity Church, and was called then to come to Texas to become the new president of Soul University in 1868. When he arrived at Soul University in Chapel Hill, it was not anything like what he thought it was going to be. It was terrible. As he walked from where he was to the school's one classroom, as you know, for those of us in Texas and Houston, when you walk on black gumbo, your feet get heavier every time you take an extra step. And that's exactly what he did. When he got to the building and discovered it was leaking like a sieve, it was absolutely just terrible. He came to a decision that day, as the president of Soul University, that there needed to be one central, unified Methodist university in Texas. I wonder why. There's no question about it. He said there's a land, there's a vision here, there needs to be something more. And so he did the impossible. From 1868 to 1872, he met with all the bishops of Texas, all the churches of Texas, and talked about a unified Methodist university where you could be able to get a great education. Now, let's think about that. Just give it some thought. In 4 years, from 1868 to 1872, he worked the miracle of miracles. But what was also interesting, he had certain ground rules by which this university needed to be set. And one of them was they needed to have $500,000 in order to begin their work. In 1872, $500,000. And people gave their land, they gave their resources, they gave their time, and there were 17 different cities that competed for this university. We could have been in Fairfield, Texas. How about Anahuac? How about Galveston? How about Houston, Temple, Waco? Georgetown won out. Georgetown won out because we had the Georgetown Institute here. It was a fine school, but it was needing some flourishing, and so they were able to take the resources to Georgetown Institute, put it with some land, put it with some resources, and they actually had $500,000 that they did to create this university. Now, I'll be very clear with you, not all of it came in. But it was pledged. And the reason why Georgetown? Well, first, it was central to Texas. Secondly, it was not on the coast. You may remember that during this period of yellow fever and malaria, fog was always thought to be the cause of malaria. And so one of the things that Francis Asbury Mood wanted to be sure was we had a university that did not have any fog. And so we came to Georgetown. Those are the reasons. That's why we're here. That's part of who we are and what we represent. But also what happened here in 1872 is that we were not known as Southwestern University. We actually organized under a different name. It was a bold name, a name that spoke of inclusivity. It talked about who we are and what we represented in Texas. Our name was Texas University. But a few months later, the legislature met and said, we need to change your name because we have a land-grant university we're going to form with that same name, and we need it. So you need to get a new name. And so we did. In 1872, we changed our name to Southwestern University. But what happened in the years from 1872 to 1884, those were the years that Francis Asbury Mood was here because he died a very unfortunate death at 54 years of age. He created a faculty that was premier in this part of the country. They were called the Five. The Five were Claude Cody in mathematics, the Reverend John McLean, one of the great preachers from the McKinsey Institute in mental and moral science, Ryland Young in modern language, Samuel Sanders in Latin and Greek, and the informable and great Robert Hire in physics, who actually reduplicated the X-ray machine and also, along with Alexander Graham Bell, was able to create telecommunications with telephones. What happened in those years was absolutely phenomenal. People from all over the state, if not the region, were coming to Georgetown, Texas to get the premier education of their lives. They were people who were preachers to be filling great pulpits, jurists and lawyers, judges, congressmen, leading citizens, leading businessmen. You can see their names all along the walls of where we stand even today. They were persons who were here early and made a tremendous difference, not only in the life of the state and the nation, but the life of the church itself. But then two things happened in the early 20th century that caused a tremendous threat to East University. The first was that Hiram Bowes, who had been a graduate of Southwestern, was now the president of Polytechnic Institute in Fort Worth. He got to thinking, now Georgetown is all right, but why don't you come to Fort Worth? You know, this is a much larger city, in the beginning of the West. This is a great place to be. You don't want to be down there. And he made a strong push to move this university to Polytechnic, which today is known as Texas Wesleyan University. To our good advantage, there was a strong resistance in Georgetown led by our own Dr. Cody. He made it very clear, we are not leaving Georgetown. And there was a resistance that felt and made itself present to the point that we rebuffed the move that Hiram Bowes, who was later elected a bishop, to be able to move us to Fort Worth. But then the greatest threat of all, and I mean the threat of all threats, came from the Board of Education of the Methodist Church itself. In 1910, 1911, they decided that they wanted another Methodist university in Texas, one that also could be able to meet not only the needs that Georgetown met, but the needs of a much greater population in a much larger city, Dallas, Southern Methodist University. Now, what was compounding this issue was not only the fact that there was wealth in Dallas and the Fort Worth area, and the church itself wanting to create another university, but the fact that our own president, Robert Hire, consented to be the president, the first president of SMU. A powerful move. I can't help but wonder, as they just finished the Cullen building as we know it today, this beautiful, magnificent structure, knowing how powerful it looked in 1890, 1895, to suddenly in 1911 be moving to some prairie land out north of Dallas where weeds were as high as your waist. But that's exactly what he did. And he created SMU. And we're thankful for SMU. Many of us not only got our education here, we've moved on to SMU, got our education there. We wish them well. And you know, they're a fine university. This last year, they went 2 ranks in the Princeton Review. They went from 61st to 59th in the country. That's great. And we're not SMU, we're Southwestern. We're number 1. Number 1 liberal arts university in the state of Texas. You know, it's amazing to think about where you rank and what you do with things. I hope SMU does well. They have a fine endowment and fine faculty. But at the same time, this school is not SMU. This school offers an education and an unparalleled piece of excellence that SMU, in all of its glory, just can't offer. We have a marvelous university with all the things that go with it and make it happen. And that's what's so good about who we are, is that we are a university that has had to work and redefine ourselves through time, that has made a difference in all of who we are. We've had to strive to be relevant. We've had to work hard. And from that period, from 1915 to 1930, were some of the most difficult days in the life of this university. Not only because of the Great Depression and the cyst that it put on us, and we give thanks for Dr. I.J. McCook, who was able to keep those books balanced and keep our doors open and our faculty paid. But also, it was in the early 1930s that we made an offer to a young man to come here to be president. He turned us down. His name was Dr. J.N.R. Russell Score. He was a young man, senior pastor of First Church Fort Worth, charismatic leader, great preacher, great speaker, great administrator, all those things. He turned us down. 7 years later, he accepted. Dr. J.N.R. Score was a man who put this university in the map that we possibly never could have had it without him. The stained window behind me is in his memory. He, of course, lived a very fine life, but he died at a very early age. One of the great stories that I remember hearing was when Lois Craddock, married to Joe Perkins, was listening to Frank Smith give a sermon here at Southwestern. And at that time, they were in the Cullen building in the old auditorium. And, of course, Lois Craddock, who had gone to school with Frank Smith back in the early 1900s, was disappointed that there wasn't a better place for Frank Smith to preach in. So she turned to her husband, Joe Perkins, and said, "We need to find a way to build a sanctuary so he can preach in a better place." Today, we are sitting in the Lois and Joe Perkins Sanctuary Chapel because of the gift that she had. You know, it's amazing to think about how things happen and how they work. And the truth of it is, we not only had a great president in J.N.R. Score, but then he was followed in his death by an equally great man, William Carrington Finch, longtime professor of religion here at Southwestern, highly respected. So much respected after he retired in 1960, became the dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School. But then, after Carrington Finch, came the outstanding presence of Dr. Durwood Fleming. Having organized the great St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Houston, which today is still one of the premier congregations in all of Methodism, he left there after 14 years to become the president of Southwestern University. It was through his contacts, his ability as an administrator, his ability as a preacher, that we began to work out relationships with the Herman Brown Foundation and the Brown Challenge. It was here that we began to start building the largesse of who we are today. And then after Durwood Fleming came the great Roy Schilling. Having been the former president of Hendrix College, he, of course, was a skilled administrator as well as an ordained elder in the church, and he helped us to move to the highest endowment this university has had in recent years. And then followed Jake Schrum, who had been a former student here, been on staff here, had been president of Texas Wesleyan University, having been on the staff with the development of Emory University, having worked with Jimmy Carter, came and worked here at Southwestern for a number of years. But I can tell you, and Jake Schrum will say this too, he said it to us at our 50th anniversary party that I had this October here at Southwestern. He said, "Never has there been a better time for a better man for this university than Edward Berger." Said, "Not since Robert Heyer have we had a faculty member, an administrator, a charismatic leader, any better to lead this university into the headwinds that are ahead of us than Edward Berger." President Berger, we thank you for your leadership, and we thank you for what you represent for us. So there's no question, we are facing headwinds. Word is out, according across the country, that things are beginning to close. If someone could have told me as a seminary student or as a young man that Lon Morris College would no longer be there, or the Texas Methodist Reporter would no longer be there, or Cokesbury would no longer have stores, I wouldn't have believed them. Today, it's been said that as many as 50 liberal arts universities in America will close, either because they don't have the funding, or because they don't have the students, or they're just simply irrelevant. And so consequently, we are at a time and place where we need to look at our history, and we need to look at who we are, and we need to understand what makes us who we are as a soul. Now, our history is part of our soul, but part of our soul is also our faculty and staff. When I think back on my years here, I think of people like Douglas Hooker and John Score and Norman Spellman. I also think in English and chemistry and biology, like Jeff Campbell and Robert Solon and Sherman Lassane and of course Gordon Wilcox and Herb Gervin in chemistry. I still remember those tests they would give you on Friday where you had to fill in the blanks, and we were all concerned about trying to just not make a zero. I also remember fine arts with Angus Springer, whose son Robert was an outstanding commentator on KPRC in Houston for many years. And then there was Drusilla Huffmaster and Ellsworth Peterson. Our deans were F. Burr Clifford and John Richards. And who can forget the immeasurable work of David Switzer as a chaplain, or Martha Allen or Bill Swift as dean of students? Those were the things that moved us and drove us. But also we had staff. Who could not want to go to the Commons and meet Sarge and not know what the mystery meat really was? Or to be able to go to the president's office and see Marjorie Beach, or to see Dr. I.J. McCook, or go by the Bishop's Memorial Union and see Staten Wood. And how about the students who were elected presidents of not only their student bodies, but also persons who became bishops of the church? Sam Hay Sr., pastor of First Church Houston, later elected a bishop, helped us to organize who we are in Houston at the Methodist Hospital. Then there was Bascom Watts, A. Frank Smith. A. Frank Smith was the pastor at Alto, Texas, and then went on to Dallas, and they were going to take two churches that were in trouble. And he was going to be the merged pastor, and they met on the third floor of Dallas Hall at SMU. Those two churches decided to change their name, and this today known as Highland Park Methodist Church. After he left Highland Park, then he went to San Antonio. After San Antonio, at 30 years of age, he became the youngest preacher ever to serve as pastor of First Church Houston, one of the largest, if not the largest Methodist church in Methodism at the time. Within 8 years, he was elected a bishop, and for 30 years, he was a bishop, 24 of those years in Houston. That was A. Frank Smith. But then also he had a relative by the name of William Angie Smith. There was Dr. Edwin D. Muzan, who lived in Galveston. There was Hiram Bowes. We have our own Joe Wilson, who's with us this morning. And then a person I went to school with here, Sharon Brown. Sharon Brown Christopher, a bishop in the North Central jurisdiction of the church. But I also think of other students like Lois Craddock Perkins, Stanley Howard Wass, one of the great theologians of this time. He tributes much of what he is to this university and to John Score. To know Stanley Howard Wass is to know a professor who was at Yale, Notre Dame, and now at Duke, highly published with Will Willimon. There's also outstanding legislators such as John Tower, who was a senator of Texas, but also our own Pete Sessions, who has served so admirably in the House. And Pete, we're glad you're here today. And then there was Joan Bray in Missouri. But who can forget the short stories of J. Frank Dobie? And who can forget the charismatic personalities of a Marion West or a Red McCombs? I also think of persons that have stood out in my life, like Jim Foster, who loved this university with his life and who was assistant to the bishop. Roberto Gomez, outstanding candidate for the episcopacy from the Rio, Texas Conference. Jim Bankston, great personal friend, former pastor at St. Paul's in Houston, still a member of your trustees. And B.T. Williamson, who of course serves as the assistant to the bishop today, who was my little brother in our fraternity here at Southwestern University. But I also want to lay this a little bit more on you. It's not just those, but the people I work with today. Today I am the corporate vice president of Houston Methodist. This is a hospital that has 8 hospitals with 24,000 employees. Last year, our budget at Houston Methodist was $4.1 billion. Out of that, $1 billion went in charity care. We are owned by the Methodist Church, and I represent the Methodist Church in that system as the executive vice president. But we also need to know that at the Texas Medical Center, if you've not checked it lately, it's the largest medical center in the world with over 50 different institutions, medical schools, nursing schools, as well as hospitals. It also is the home of Methodist Hospital, which is the number ranked hospital in Texas by U.S. News and World Report for the last 6 years straight. Last year we had 108,000 people who were admitted, and we had over 1 million outpatient procedures. Our assets at this point are $10.1 billion. If you were to take SMU with $1.5 billion and you take Houston Methodist with $10.1 billion, that means that Houston Methodist may be actually 5 times larger than SMU. But it's interesting to note that this is a university and we have the same values. We have the same names. We have the same goals for being able to help and create people. We have opportunities to do things. When I look across the Texas Medical Center, I can't help but remember a young James Adams who was in school with me here, who later became a doctor and, of course, was formidable in setting up the Neurological Intensive Care Center for Texas Children's Hospital. Dr. Adams is one of our great alums. But then I also think of Dr. Tim Boone, a graduate of this university, cousin to Dan Stultz. He's someone who not only has his medical degree, but his PhD. He's the director of Institute of Academic Medicine for the Houston Methodist Hospital System, has over 300 residents and over 50 different programs. He is someone who's a formidable force in Houston, if not the world. And then I think of Keith Barber, who's our CEO at Houston Methodist Willowbrook, a graduate here in the 1980s, an outstanding CEO of one of the finest hospitals in America out northwest of Houston. And then I think of Erin Skelly, who's a graduate of Southwestern, who, of course, worked with our Houston Methodist Foundation. She's responsible for all our sponsorships. You've heard us: Houston Astros, Houston Texans, the Houston Symphony, the Houston Orchestra, as well as the Houston Rodeo. All of those are a part of her purview of her work with the Houston Methodist Foundation. But then I'm very proud, newly named member of our Board of Advisors, Mark Easterly. I went to school with Mark Easterly's father, Gene Easterly, here at Southwestern. He now is a sweet mate of mine just around the corner. He's the Vice President of Legal for Houston Methodist. What this all comes down to is this: we have a soul. Our soul is in our history. It's in our faculty. It's in our staff. But it's also in us. We are the living legacies that pull us forward. Our motto is non quis si quid. Not who, but what. It's not who you are, but what you become. And today, this world needs Southwestern University. There are so many people today that are going to so many different directions, looking for purpose in their life and meaning. And a lot of places are offering great training. You can train to become a great electrician. You can train to become a great IT personality. You can train to do a lot of things. But this university just doesn't train you. This university educates you. It helps you to learn. It helps you to know. It helps you to continue to learn. It helps you to know that you're constantly always reinventing yourself and redefining yourself. The truth of it is, we stand on foundations we have not built. And we drink from wells we have not dug. But today, we need to do some building and we need to do some digging, because the soul of Southwestern is continuing, and it's continuing with us.